Hello, everyone, and apologies for the delay in terms of starting this session. We had a slight technical glitch, but we are now all online, and I'm absolutely delighted to say that we're going to be discussing today an issue which is absolutely critical in terms of how we go forward in tackling climate change. In the last couple of weeks at Glasgow, we've had a tremendous amount of focus on what can be done on the private sector in terms of improving reporting functions in relation to climate change. However, the focus we've had on the private sector hasn't been matched in the public sector thus far to the same degree. So what we're going to be talking about today is how and why and where governments can jump into that breach, if you like, or into that gap and start producing better statistics, better ways of tracking the economy, better ways of tracking the financial system to really capture the questions which were raised in Glasgow about how we can move towards a net zero world. So we have a terrific group of people to discuss these issues today, both from the IMF but also from governments. And so perhaps I can start off by asking starting with a representative from Barbados and ask them, how do you see the role of government statistics in terms of trying to shape the debate about climate change? And what are you doing to try and do a better job of capturing what's happening inside your country?
Well, I thank you for the opportunity to participate. And perhaps I should start from the fact that even if I wanted to do something different locally, it wouldn't have any capacity to help me outside of Barbados or with anybody with whom I'm interacting. So the issue is not what I'm doing in Barbados. The issue is what the international community is permitting us to do. And therefore, what are the norms? What are the things that are acceptable for us to be able to do? We've been fighting a battle now for over 3 decades with respect to having indices that reflect vulnerability be settled upon by the global community, for the very simple reason that without an appreciation of vulnerability and capacity to recover, then we don't have a true appreciation of what small island developing states and, in some instances, larger countries that may be low income or middle income face. And with climate, it is even all the more critical that we get it right now. And to that extent, for the first time in the last few years, 2-3 years, we're beginning to see the word vulnerability intrude upon all of the discussions and dialogue that we're having internationally. The issue, of course, is that the international financial institutions and the multilateral development banks and the international credit rating agencies are all driven by normal metrics of GDP per capita, GNI, which sounds lovely and has worked well for those who can allow it to work well for them. But once we start now dealing with the reality of what we face as a country with respect to climate, you begin to see that that metric cannot be used, because on the basis of that metric, Barbados and the Bahamas cannot borrow from the World Bank Group. Now, we just got and had to fight very, very hard in order to get exceptional access. And it almost sounds, if we go out of this arena and go and talk to the ordinary person on the Clapham omnibus, or as I would say, the average man or woman in a rum shop in Barbados, they will tell you, what are you talking about? You mean a country that had Abaco and Grand Bahama flattened like if a nuclear bomb had dropped on it, cannot borrow from the World Bank for what do you call, for climate purposes? And in fact, the exceptional access has only, according to them, in spite of the fact that we've written asking for climate and pandemic, there's a view that it has only been given to us for the pandemic. Now, by the same token, my own country, in July, on the 2nd of July, had its first hurricane in 66 years. And that hurricane came after a freak storm that occurred 2 weeks before, that literally had 46,000 lightning strikes in 90 minutes, and thunder coming from the bowels of the earth as opposed to claps of thunder from the sky, accompanied by horizontal rain and wind. Now, when you have these kinds of climatic events, and that has nothing at all to do, I might add, with the ashfall, the volcanic ashfall that we received from the eruption in St. Vincent, which is 90 miles away, And while not immediately related to the climatic crisis, is still nevertheless a natural disaster event that can destabilize a country and for which there has to be financing for recovery. The United Nations Development Program and others here helped us measure the loss. The loss to the overall economy is just over 1% of GDP for the volcanic ashfall. And the financial cost of the rebuilding of the houses for the persons who lost their properties, 90% of whom were below the poverty line and 95% of whom were not insured, has now to be carried by the state. And the state will probably have to look for another 1.5% of GDP at least in circumstances where we are in an IMF program in order to be able to meet these issues. This, I have not yet touched the costs that we have as a result of water shortages, groundwater crises, also to be able to deal with that. So the nonsense of using GDP per capita to be able to determine who should access funding or how the international community views us is buttressed perhaps by the recognition by the Secretary General of the United Nations that a world that is consumed only with GDP measurement will inevitably destroy itself in short order, largely because it is not sustainable development in many instances. And that growth at the cost of everything else is not what the world ought to be measuring at this point in time as we go forward. So first and foremost, we need to find metrics that are more appropriate to the reality of our condition. And GDP, while useful in helping to guide us in looking at what is happening in a country, cannot be sufficient. And I give another example too. A small state like us, and I've determined we need to be using more metrics related to GNI, largely because if you want to be able to encourage export of goods and services, people need to see what the impact is literally and how you're measuring it. In our country, there has been too little emphasis on capital formation and on GNI as small states. And I think that the absence of those metrics has meant that people don't necessarily treat to it with the urgency and to understand that small states such as this with open economies have to be able to minimize their risk. And one of the ways of doing that is encouraging the export of capital as well. And how do we measure then that export of capital, particularly in the context of a single market and single economy, as we have here in the Caribbean, and particularly against the backdrop of opportunities being presented by other parts of the single market, as is the case now with Guyana, who is likely to see, and Guyana was the only country in the Americas that grew last year, and will continue to see exponential growth, having been a hippie country for most of its independence period. So bottom line, why am I here? Because I'm not an economist, no, I'm not a financier, but I appreciate evidence. I'm a lawyer. And evidence is critical in order to make the best policy decisions that we can make. The evidence has to be captured. If we use adjectives, then it is subject to the view of the person reading the document or listening. If we use quantifiable metrics, then we have a platform for transparency that allows persons to be able to better determine what their role is, how we cooperate, what the gaps are, and how we move forward. And I therefore want to encourage the IMF and to thank them for this type of event and to ask them to appreciate that it is only in the deconstruction of our condition that we will get an appreciation as to what is needed in order to protect our countries from these global challenges that are literally destroying economic activity and social stability in our midst. So I'll stop at this end. I do have to go back in at cabinet at some point, but I will stay for a little while before going back into chair cabinet. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that very forceful intervention. And the reason I wanted to start with you is because you are actually at the front lines, Prime Minister, of seeking to explain, or rather living with the effects of climate change and grappling with the question of how economies are or are not measured. I'd like to bring in Christina Costiel at that point, because you are Deputy Director of Strategy for Policy and Review Department of the IMF. Having just heard that very powerful intervention from the Prime Minister, can you tell us whether that's a view that's often expressed by developing nations that are at the forefront of climate change, and what do you think the IMF can do about this?
No, I think it was a very powerful testimony, and it almost left me speechless, because it is really, climate change is so here and there, and you see that increasingly. And I think it is particularly the small states that are affected, and also who's disproportionately affected are the low-income countries. So really making the situation much, much worse. And from our side, we have various initiatives, because it is all about evidence and understanding things. And let me talk about one initiative that I think is very important, because what we see and what's becoming increasingly clear is climate is a big macroeconomic challenge. And so in order to address climate change, you need macroeconomic policies. So we're talking first and foremost about fiscal policies, but also supplemented by the right financial sector policies, by the right monetary policies. So what we did is we reached out to our area department teams who are at the forefront of the discussions with policymakers. And we asked them, if you want to have meaningful discussions with policymakers, what are the kind of data you need? And not surprisingly, they came back to us and I said, because this is so broad, because climate change is affecting the broad macroeconomics policies, we also need to have a broad array of data to better understand climate change, to monitor it, and then really help policymakers to make the right decision. And I think there was an earlier session today that talked about the climate dashboard that we did in response to this, and really that shows you also on the dashboard, it goes through an array of data, because what we need to know is what's the impact on real activity, consumption, production, and what is really happening to a country in terms of emissions, in terms of temperatures, and in terms of sea levels. Of course, we need to understand what are the cross-border implications, and again, small states thinking about here what's happening on tourism, trade, FDI. We need to understand then what is the role of the government, and what is the government doing on the revenue side, what are environmental taxes, and what is the government doing in terms of subsidies and in terms of R&D. That's particularly an issue for the advanced economies. And then, of course, we need to understand the impact on the financial sector, in particular the physical and the transition risk. So that's one part we're working on. And then there is a big other part, because this is the macro data. And we're also working with many other institutions on the firm level data, on the corporate data, because that is also critical, because we need to have the private sector come in with financing. That also, Julian, as you said, that came out very clearly in Glasgow, and we have some very encouraging initiatives, particularly from GFANS, and we're also very active in that area, working with the FSB, with the NGFS, working with the IFRS to get really also the firm level data. Well, over for me.
Right. Well, thank you. Well, obviously, as I said earlier, the focus in Glasgow was really quite remarkable, and the creation of both the GFANS, which is a Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, but also the ISSB, or as I prefer to call it, the ISB, because I think the ISB is easier to pronounce, and I like thinking of two Korean boy bands on stage. You know, the ISB meet the GFANS. I think makes the whole thing slightly more exciting. That heavy focus on the reporting aspect, and what the IFRS Foundation is trying to do is very, very remarkable. But again, the question that comes back to my mind over and over again is, where is the public sector in this respect? So I'd like to bring in Eric van Nostrand, who's the head of research for sustainable investments at BlackRock, because you are essentially paid to try and analyze investments. You're getting more and more data from the private sector to help you do this. But what about the public sector and the governmental sector? How do you feel about where things are going on that front?
Thanks very much, Jillian. It's great to be here with this distinguished group. I love the way you set up the conversation, Julian, because that's exactly where we're focused when we think about the ways to evolve sustainable data, both for investment purposes, but also to figure out the best way for the financial sector to, to contribute to a better resolution on climate change more broadly. I think it's clear that it has to be a partnership, and in fact, sometimes we see a bit of a faux debate, if you will, between whether the public sector or the private sector is better suited by itself to, to be deploying capital and creating incentives to help address both the data challenges and the more general problem of incentives around climate change in the markets today. And I think that apparent trade-off that it has to be one or the other is a false choice. I think a lot of the real progress we've made on the data front in understanding the specific mechanisms by which climate change is affecting the global economy, both in the near term and over the course of the transition, come from an integrated approach where the public sector is encouraging more data disclosure, more importantly, standardization of disclosure, and private sector actors are recognizing the importance of understanding this data to their risk and return. We think at BlackRock, we think we're at a real inflection point for sustainability data generally, in the sense that my ability as an investor to talk about and understand different companies' exposure to climate change is radically different than it was 2 years ago, both in terms of understanding the physical risks inherent of companies with exposures to physical areas with elevated risks from climate change, as well as transition risks, the changing business models and economic models that are going to respond to climate change. But I also think my understanding today will look quite silly, will look quite simplistic compared to the kind of data we're going to have in the next 2 years. I'll make one specific point about where I think the next kind of leap forward in sustainable data has to be. And that's beyond just the kind of direct measurement of how much emissions a particular company emits. We need to understand better the indirect impacts of a company's or a country's activities up and down the value chain. For the technical folks out there, I'm talking about scope 3 carbon emissions, really. I'm talking about the full impact from suppliers down to customers of a given company's activity. We think that understanding that better is going to matter to investments. It's going to matter to public policy outcomes. And we again think there needs to be a public-private partnership to encourage better disclosure of that data.
Well, that's very interesting. Just before I go on to the other academics on the panel, I mean, in terms of scope 3 emissions, though, do you think that the banks that signed up to the GFANs have the foggiest idea of what they've signed up to in terms of essentially potentially owning the emissions that their borrowers are going to produce or hopefully not produce in future years?
Well, I think the recognition as an investor that those banks are closely associated with the emissions up and down the value chain that's an unavoidable economic truth. As a fiduciary to my clients, I have to recognize that the financial performance of an entity that's financing different elements of the carbon transition is going to depend heavily on how exposed they are to the upsides and downsides of climate change over the transition to come. So if I am an investor, I'm not thinking about those scope 3 data, even if it feels in the case of an investment bank more remote from the company's initial activities, then I'm missing out on the real impact of climate change on those investments. So I think it's a key area of focus both within the financial sector and for the public policy world.
Right. I must say, from my point of view, I think that people have not yet fully understood the significance, really quite revolutionary and radical significance of moving from scope 1 to scope 3, and the fact this has almost been slipped in under the radar, and certainly it's sort of part of the fine print. I think even many C-suite haven't really noticed yet, and could be potentially very significant. But the reason why I wanted to bring in the two academic observers last of all is because you're both of you, Amar Bhattacharya and James Stock. Amar Bhattacharya is with Brookings, James Stock is with Harvard University. You're both in a position to take a sort of detached one might say, almost cynical, holistic view of what's going on. Maybe I can start with you, Professor Bhattacharya. What do you make of the current direction in terms of, we've had all these bold pledges about trying to be much more transparent, particularly in the private sector, and now the public sector is talking about catching up. Do you believe that it's going to work?
Before I take the detached view, may I take a passionate view?
Absolutely, yes, please. Well,
I just wanted to say that in support of Prime Minister Motley, the vicious cycle of debt and climate vulnerability in countries such as hers, and the problem of the lack of finance is, I think, an issue that the world community really needs to address. I've been pressing it for a while, and that's not the question you asked me. I just wanted to make that statement. I wanted to just frame the climate data issue. And I want to say, the first question we should ask ourselves, why do we need better climate data? And in my view, we need it for three reasons. We need it because it is foundational to international cooperation and governance. If we are building everything around cooperation, then what are countries, what are firms, everybody committing to? Second, and that means particularly around emissions, we need climate data because it is, the impact of climate change has become a much more important issue, and we need very precise information around impact of climate change. And third reason we need it is because it is about the financial institutions and financial companies, and that's both about physical risk, but also about transition risk. So I just wanted to say something which has been highlighted in the past couple of weeks, which is the really big gaps in emission data in the world. There was an article, there was a research kind article in the Washington Post suggesting that when you look at, both individual country data, but also when you add it up, we may be underestimating emissions by as much as 15 to 20%. That is a big deal, and we have to tackle it. The best way to tackle it is actually through the use of Sentinel satellites. We can get much more precise information. There's a very interesting study just put out yesterday in the Brookings website by three colleagues from the World Bank, basically saying that using satellite data, it is possible to look at performance of the top 500 cities in terms of carbon emissions. And I won't give away any surprises, but you should look at it because it is very instructive. And you can do the same thing with countries, So geographically rigorous data on climate emissions is something that we should be pushing for. And probably the lowest hanging fruit is using Sentinel satellite data. So that's one point I wanted to make. Second, with regard to physical risks, so much of the world is not covered with systematic observations around meteorological data. There is the WMO launched an initiative called the Systematic Observations Financing Facility to close those gaps, especially for vulnerable countries. But we have had great difficulty in mobilizing the necessary financing for that initiative. It's not enough just to collect that information. There's an initiative coming out of Oxford, which I think is very promising, which is how do you use this information, a kind of a CERN-like climate initiative, to then be able to pinpoint climate impact in detail so that it can help with resilience and adaptation. So we need much, much better data, in input data and output data around resilience and adaptation. And of course, in the area that you are mentioning, whether it's GFAN or TCFD, we clearly need much better data, not just on the physical risk, but also on the transition risk. We need standardization, we need around stress testing, and we need to be able to evaluate the famous what's the temperature of your portfolio. are you really being consistent or are you greenwashing? So I think that on that, as you know, at Glasgow, the Secretary General announced this initiative around quality of the data, and the, how it is being used. So I think there will be a lot of churning in the next, couple of years, but that's very good because I think that the data and the use of data will interact in a way that we will get to a better place.
Well, it certainly is quite a remarkable moment. I mean, I wrote a column recently pointing out that never before has mankind been able to hold up a mirror to itself in cyberspace in real time to this degree. And I suspect it may yet end up being one of the most potent drivers for action to stop climate change if it works. But we don't know if it will work. Professor Stock, what is your perspective on this? Are you optimistic that this is going to help drive change, the type of improved reporting? Or are you in the camp of those who say that it simply is too little too late?
Oh, so that's a great question. Let me just actually underscore one thing Professor Bhattacharya said, which is collecting improved emissions data is incredibly important if we think about really making sure that the policies that have been pledged are implemented. And it's not just carbon dioxide emissions. Methane emissions are tremendously important, more difficult to measure. Some satellite measurements are potentially possible, but it's more complicated, and that is really necessary on the mitigation side. I guess I'd say just one thing on the data side I do want to underscore, and this goes back to Prime Minister Motley's comments. I agree that GDP is a pretty limited measure. It's been very useful for many purposes. As a macroeconomist, we've used GDP in lots of constructive ways over the years, but it's really the case in all institutions, and certainly this is the case politically, that one tends to manage to what one can measure. And we can measure GDP, so we tend to really focus on whether GDP growth is positive and that sort of thing. There's been a couple of good papers in this conference, and there's quite a big growing literature that is stressing the importance of moving to welfare measures that incorporate climate and ecosystem services and other environmental impacts. And I strongly endorse that. I think that's a great project. That really is a project that is something that government agencies or the IMF or international institutions can guide, because it's in the camp of GDP accounting, and you've got to understand all the hard stuff of GDP accounting, and then on top of that you do the hard stuff of ecosystem services flows and so forth, health impacts and of climate and all of that. And it's tough, but I strongly endorse that move. I guess you also asked, stepping back or going back to your question, you asked about optimism here. More data is good. So more data is great. I think understanding the Scope 3 emissions, that's going to be a really important step forward. If we can collect those data, and if we can get those data, and we can put pressure on to have those data really being reliable. I guess I would put myself in the camp of being, what's the right way to say this? It is terrific that we are having enthusiasm around quantifiable ESG investing. It is terrific that we're having enthusiasm around carbon pledges by private corporations. It is terrific that we have individuals who want to do their best to reduce the amount that they drive or to reduce the amount that they fly, or make other changes in their lifestyles that are going to support a lower carbon footprint. But none of that, in my view, comes close to being a substitute for serious economic policy at a governmental level. And there are some governments that are comfortable moving forward, but frankly, they're in the minority. The pledges that we had at Glasgow, those were good pledges. They were strong pledges, and there's forward progress. But our willingness to even live up to those pledges is incredibly limited. And maybe I'm looking at this through a U.S. perspective, which is especially frustrating. But I do want to go back to this basic point that we have a fundamental need for serious economic policy, serious climate policy at a governmental level, not a city level, not a subnational level, but true governmental national sovereign state level.
Right. Well, thank you very much indeed. I would like to bring in Prime Minister Motley again, because I know that you do have to go off to the cabinet meeting at some point. You are in the business of actually doing a day job running a country, so I understand completely. And I'd say it's great to have you as part of this panel. But I'd like to ask you, in terms of, first of all, whether you'd like to comment on what you've heard, but secondly, one of the great themes at Glasgow in the conversations I was part of with the GFANs and things like that was this idea that people could start channeling private sector capital into countries like your own, if only they had quantifiable, measurable projects that they could actually see. And maybe they could do that through a kite mark system, through blended finance, measures like that. Do you have any comments on that, or any comments on what you just heard from the IMF and the others?
Yeah, I think that one of the things is that we have to appreciate what is the capacity of a small state. And there's nothing like a pandemic and a climate crisis to make you realize you're small. And I understand that fully now. What I do accept, yes, we will need blended finance, but when all is said and done, we're still a nation state. And we still have all of the same people who have the same desires and hopes as other countries. So that we have to be careful that when we bring in capital as well, that we still create mechanisms to have that capital marry local capital, whether individual or institutional, so as to ensure that citizens do not become tenants in their own country. That is an absolute critical component. We're seeing the worst aspects of it play out in the United States of America with identity politics, and how that has, in fact, as a result of the lack of feeling of being included or participating in the mainstream economy in a country as large as the United States of America, we've seen the backlash that that has had in terms of politics, and all politics is local wherever you are. Having said that, there are genuine capacity issues in terms of innovation, and what we find even within the Caribbean community is that we've sometimes got to reach outside of it in order to build the capacity to look at the things that we can do in terms of new instruments, and how we can blend some of those new instruments with existing realities of politics, as I just said. How do you have your local population work alongside them? The other key issue that bothers us, of course, is that debt just doesn't work. Debt just doesn't work because most of these countries are highly indebted already, not because of profligacy, as I keep saying, or corruption, but because of the continuous adjustment to a global economic system and community that has placed serious obligations on them. So let's take the WTO. When the WTO was formed, it said basically there could be no special and differential treatment for countries like us. It didn't accept vulnerability then either. As a result of that, we said, look, but why are you doing this? Because our percentage of share in global trade in goods is 0.00000%, and our percentage of global trade of share in services is 0.00001%. So we have no capacity to distort at all. And therefore, we need a set of measures that can still allow us to protect our domestic productive sectors in agriculture and manufacturing. Well, I don't need to tell you what happened. Rejected, not taken on board. What has happened in our countries, these productive sectors have literally been decimated. Barbados used to have a garment industry up to the 1980s. It doesn't have one now in the same way. We can go through sector by sector by sector. Domestic production of food dropped. And then, of course, comes a pandemic that leads also to a disruption in the supply chain that now causes us, along with the climate, to recognize that, you know what, food security does matter. Food and nutritional security does matter. And we do have to produce these things. But at the end of the day, if we don't have the capacity to be able to borrow to finance, and we don't have a private sector that's deep enough, then you need to bring in money. But when you bring in the money, you can't exclude who is there. So it is really far more complex than most people appreciate. But because we're small, it's not taken up, and we're just dismissed. And the question is, can we be acceptable collateral damage in a global community that cares about people? I say no. And if I say no, then what are the steps that need to be put in place to measure in quantifiable terms what we need? You talk about the projects. Well, we want to be able to do more projects, but we don't have the capacity necessarily within the government to have the skill set to do all of the things in the manner in which they need to be done. Those who are at the Brookings Institute are fortunate, and I am sometimes jealous of policy institutes like yours, largely because you have that capacity there. Now, the IMF has been kind, and in fact, I think this year, next month, celebrates the 20th anniversary of CARTAT, which is a center that has been placed here to help and to recognize that there is a shortage of skills. I do feel, however, that it needs substantial expansion in order for us to meet some of these new requirements as to how do we compute, for example, an appropriate framework for loss and damage. Because I'm not an economist and a financier, I have a simple approach. I say take 1% from the fossil fuel companies, 1% off of the top of gross, and put it into a fund that those countries that are suffering loss or damage can access on the basis of, obviously, consequential damage. By the same token, I recognize that if we're going to do the adaptation that has to happen, because 1.5 is not that thing that is at the end of a road, that is a clear road and there are no potholes along the way. 1.5 is riddled with floods and droughts and all of these other things along the way. So you're spending even as you get to that point. And therefore, to that extent, I believe that the adaptation funding has to be thought out very, very clearly. And that it may not actually, and I don't know that we can limit it to climate alone either, and I leave this for what it is worth. Right now, the pandemic is really that thing that has driven double-digit declines economically in most tourism and travel-dependent countries of the world. Similarly, we're talking about this pandemic, but I actually chair the committee for the World Health Organization, along co-chair it with the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, for the One Health Global Initiative, which is the slow motion pandemic that really threatens to reverse a century of medical progress because the antibiotics just are not working anymore. So that unless you spend the $9 billion a year that is needed, and the $25 billion that the high-level group says is needed to avert and avoid the next pandemic and to strengthen the global public common goods system, that's $24 billion there alone, and we haven't talked climate. So I think we're at that point in the world where the IFIs have to, one, revisit their purpose, but in order for the revisiting of their purpose to be effective, they then have to have the measurements of what is really happening in our countries, which means the stats become absolutely critical, the skill set becomes critical, then for the decisions to be made. We are human, and we make the best decisions that we can based on the best available evidence. And the best available evidence is largely driven by independent verifiable data such as statistics. So a long roundabout way to tell you that I do feel that there are opportunities, but I think that we need to realize that there is a deficit in terms of capacity to be able to get us where we need to go, and that there is need for new thinking as to some of the instruments and some of the data that needs to be collected in order for us to get there.
Well, that's a very powerful, passionate plea, as I said earlier, to basically call for really quite a radical rethink in terms of the IFIs and how they're operating, but also the member states that, of course, are the shareholders and how they're operating. I'm just curious.
If I might say this, one of the things that we're talking about, even with the recreation of the IFIs, is a recognition, as I said in Glasgow, we did not exist when these IFIs were formed. And for the most part, the IFIs continue to finance projects that could be financed perhaps easier by the private sector. So why not concentrate on the global public goods that we really, really need help with and that are really very difficult to identify financing for? And it's largely because of the absence of clear data, as you correctly pointed out, or properly structured frameworks for how we're measuring what we're doing, both in the economic and social sectors.
Right. Well, I must say, I heard very similar comments in Glasgow. I heard some passionate speeches from some of the African representatives pointing out that they were responsible for almost none of the global climate emissions, ex-South Africa. Without South Africa, the rest of the African continent produces less emissions than Bitcoin on most days, but is still being asked to do all kinds of things that they feel they can't measure or reach up to. Fiji gave an incredibly powerful speech about how they found it impossible to tap into green sustainability instruments. on any kind of sensible pricing level. And the Maldives gave another equally passionate speech about how they are literally sinking as the other countries are discussing the issues, not doing stuff. So there's a lot of, I think, very strong feeling right now, particularly given the broken $100 billion promises. Just one last quick question before I turn to the panel. Do you think, in fact, developed countries are getting it wrong and they should just focus on giving out grants, not loans, not blended finance initiatives, and that would be easier given the measurement problems?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a fairy tale. I don't think life is going to work that way. I do think that people should be responsible for some of the capital that we are accepting. So I do think that we need a blend of grants. We need a blend of private sector driven capital, but mixed with our own domestic capital from the private sector as well. And then some loans. But as I keep saying, no sense in giving me loans if I can't spend it, because if I don't have the fiscal space to spend, it's just an exercise in frustration. So if, for example, I'm in an IMF program now, you can say Barbados can borrow XYZ at 0%. But if I can't access it because I have to drive to run a primary surplus of 6% or 3%, then it's no use to me. And perhaps one of the things that's not being paid enough attention to is, and I'm not an economist, I say again, but what is the magic of 60% debt to GDP? What is the magic of an 80% debt to GDP? At some point, yes, you have to pick a number, but have we not picked it at too low end on the spectrum, recognizing, and with all due respect to Rogoff, but recognizing that what we face now is literally existential. And let me put it in context for you before I leave you. In 13 years, based on a National Population Commission report that Barbados, we ordered for the first time in our 55 years of independence, Barbados will have a smaller workforce in 13 years' time than it does now. Matter for a national security threat. In 13 years' time, the 1.5 will be hovering in front of us anywhere between 12 to 15 years if we do not get it right in the next few years in this decade, so that we face potentially graver crises than we are experiencing now. And in 13 years' time, 14 years' time, we are supposed to have a debt to GDP ratio, I can't remember, it's 60%. Explain that equation to me.
Well,
at the time of the gravest threats, you're asking us to go to a level that may mean that how much ever you put in front of me, I can't access unless it is grant. So I'm not asking for grant, but I am conscious that we have to have a significant amount of it, but not all grant.
Well, as I said, it's a very passionate description of the challenge you face. I think crystallizes very powerfully the sometimes rather abstract discussions that happen in Washington. So thank you very much indeed. I guess I'd like to bring, thank you. I'd like to bring in at this point, maybe Eric, and ask you, you at BlackRock are sitting on a lot of potential capital, which could be redeployed. When you look at a country like Barbados, can you find projects to invest in that move some of the capital from where it currently is into where it needs to go? Will the private sector provide any answer to this?
Well, as I said up front, I think it's important to design structures like this in partnership between the public and private sector. And I am deeply moved by a lot of the points that the Prime Minister laid out in emphasizing the need for us to take more nuanced looks at the data underlying the way climate change is affecting economies. I strongly agree that any aggregate growth measure, Prime Minister cited GDP, isn't going to give us the nuanced picture we need of who really is at the most risk from different, evolutions of the climate landscape. If you asked me to identify the #1 data shortfall in sustainability globally right now, I would say that even as we've been complaining a little bit on this panel about the details about the extent to which we can't see Scope 3 data in the developed world. To me, that's far away from the #1 biggest data shortfall, which is that in the emerging world generally, and outside of a relatively small handful of the highest GDP per capita countries in the world, even basic data on scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions is woefully deficient. And that does prevent barriers to, to understanding the specific nature of micro investments that can be made in the emerging world. But it's our strong view at BlackRock, and we've written publicly about this in a number of forums, that we need to find ways, again, in partnership with public sector, with policymakers and with private capital, to make sure we are nonetheless channeling private capital and public capital into the emerging world. Because we do think there's a bit of an inverse correlation between where the data is most robust and where the need is greatest, as the Prime Minister cited. And I think that's not something that industry can do by itself, but in partnership with global frameworks to identify, the countries most in need, I think there's a lot of productive work that can be done.
Right. Well, and that seems a good moment to bring in Professor Bhattacharya, because as you heard from the Prime Minister, they'd love to have Brookings there in Barbados, crunching the numbers and exploring all kinds of policy ideas and writing nice, slick, fancy papers and things like that, all the stuff that Brookings does so well. Do you have any thoughts on what she said, other than perhaps the Brookings employees are volunteering en masse to go and hang out in Barbados each winter?
Well, I think the challenge of climate change requires not just the best brains, but purposeful action on the part of all. And I think the area where we have fallen short is really more the action agenda rather than the thought agenda. So let me just say that the next decade and the next 3 decades will require an extraordinary level of investment. I just want to come back to the point that she was raising. Why? Because investment is the way, in some sense, to respond to the growth challenge. It's a way to respond to the climate challenge. It's the way to respond to the development challenge. And the area which has particularly come to the fore right now is we need a massive upscaling in the energy transition investment. We need to really ramp up renewables in order to be able to preempt, in some sense, the growth of fossil fuels. We need to ramp up renewables in order to be able to electrify everything, and we need to be able to ramp up renewables to generate green hydrogen. And the prospects right now of leapfrogging are tremendous. We can build things in a way that, we could not do in the 20th century. So Nick Stern and I often call this the growth story of the 21st century, the opportunity to do things in a much better way. So for countries like Barbados, for Africa, for India, and even for South Africa, the hope is that actually this is not just about climate, it's about a new form of growth. But in order to do that, we need to have the information, we need to have the policies to make that shift. And the South African political declaration that came forth at Glasgow, which I have been quite involved, I think was one of the bright spots of a very practical way now to persuade countries to move in the kind of direction that's needed and to get the international partnership both from the public and the private sector. So yes, I'm very happy to go to Barbados and think, but I'd rather be, where I am trying to push the action agenda.
Right. Well, I think that's very well put. I should say in a couple of minutes, I'm going to be opening up the discussion to questions. We do have some good questions already coming in on the chat function. Do put any questions you have into the chat function, and we will pick them up in a few minutes. But before I do that, I'd like to quickly turn to Professor Stock and see whether you have any comments, or whether, Christine, you have any comments from the perspective of the IMF.
Sure. I think if we think about the financing challenges for developing countries, obviously they're tremendously large. It's useful to think about them as financing for the energy transition, and then useful to think about them as financing for adaptation. And adaptation, I guess I would put in that not just the physical adaptation of adjusting to hurricanes and so forth, but all of the health impacts of climate change. So there's going to be a wide scope of different costs. On the energy transition, and then of course it's useful to keep in mind that this is fundamentally the responsibility or the default of actions that the developed economies have taken over many years, most importantly the United States, but developed economies generally. So, with bearing that in mind, the energy transition, I guess my view on that is that the most important thing that we can do in developed economies is really figure out how to make it very cheap for green electricity and green sources of energy to be adopted widely in developing countries. And we've seen tremendous improvements and cost declines in wind and solar and so forth. There's a lot more to go in terms of really making it accessible at the price points that are needed. But that's fundamentally a job for developed economies in terms of driving down those costs significantly. Do we want to push developing economies towards decarbonization when it's expensive now? I guess my sense is that really seems like an unfair ask. That there's important we just heard from the Prime Minister the wide range of challenges that they're facing, and to layer on top of that and ask for energy transition work if we're not going to provide the cheap technology and provide the funding, that just doesn't fly. Not only is it morally incorrect, it's simply impractical. It's not going to happen. I think the challenges with health impacts and adaptation more generally, that's really tough because fundamentally that there's not going to be easy technological solutions or inexpensive technological solutions to that. Those are going to require significant expenditures. I sure hope that there are mechanisms that we can see for developed economies to move forward on that. I guess it's hard to be optimistic, I have to say, just thinking about this as a matter of practical political reality.
Right. Christina, any thoughts about what the IMF could or should be doing on this front?
Yeah, lots of thoughts actually, Julian, and I think one of the themes I'm hearing here, and I think that's very clear, given that addressing climate change is so super urgent and that this decade is so critical, it's sort of an all hands on deck situation. And when we're talking about transition and adaptation, I'm really taking the Prime Minister's comment and also Jim's comment. I mean, the higher the temperature, the more adaptation and transition there is needed. So first and foremost, we need to address mitigation. And this is from our side, what we've been being very clear that countries need to think about a comprehensive mitigation package. And ideally with carbon pricing at the heart of this, because pricing signals are very important to tell investors, this is where you want to go. And here also, I want to draw your attention to what we have been proposing, which is an international carbon price floor among the largest emitters. Ideally, everybody would be moving, but if you just get the largest emitters, and think about the US, European Union, China, India, that covers 2/3 of the emissions. And if you could get an agreement there, you could go very far on mitigation. And in our proposal, we've been very careful on how this could potentially be designed. One important aspect is that this could be differentiated by level of income, and that goes back to the Paris Agreement principle of differentiated responsibilities. It would also be very pragmatic and doesn't have to be implemented through a tax. It can be implemented through emissions trading system, it can be implemented through fee-based, it can be implemented through regulations. So countries can tailor how they want to do it. And I think another very thing about this, it removes uncertainty. And really, like, I think for the private sector, it's also important to know where the carbon price is going to go in the future if I invest in energy companies. Mm. So it removes uncertainty, and it removes also the risk from going into the direction of border carbon adjustments. That is a much less effective measure than having a carbon price. And of course, I think another important point is political economy considerations are there. It is difficult to move ahead with carbon pricing. But if you have a coordinated effort by the largest emitters, that can actually help also overcoming these concerns. But this is not it. I mean, this needs to be, in our view, the centerpiece. And then two other very important pieces that need to be there. One is green investment. And there the public sector has to come in to think about power grid extensions, vehicle charging stations. And the good news here is that that can actually be good for jobs. And we've done estimates that if you have a comprehensive green investment package, you put it together with green supply policies, actually it could lift global GDP by some 2% by 2030, and it could create some 30 million jobs, and that's great news. And then the other part of this has to be, you need to have a fair transition. And I think we've been hearing that from the other panelists. You have fairness, number one, within a country. And what is important, we've seen it with globalization, some people are carrying more on the costs of globalization or of climate change. And we need to think about how to bring those people in and how to help those who are adversely affected. And then there is the big question, and we've been hearing from Mr. Muthi very loud and clear, of a fair transition also across countries. And we've both been in Glasgow, Julian, and I've heard, the 100 billion, so difficult, and it's not yet there, but also the whole issue of technology transfers. And these are asked by many countries, and they have to be part of a package. And maybe just the last thought I want to say, if just advanced economies move, it is not going to be enough. Because when you look at a business as usual scenario in 2030, 70% of the emissions are actually with emerging market economies.
Right. Well, we're getting some great questions already. So I'm going to actually start with one for Eric, which says, could you please elaborate and or give an example of the private-public partnership projects you have in mind? That's from Gabriel Romero. We also have a question from somebody else, which is public-private partnerships. Is this actually a case of just moving ahead in line with government initiatives?
Well, I think that's definitely a large part of it. To emphasize what specifically I'm thinking about, although we think there's room for these initiatives too, not necessarily focused on projects that take the legal form of public-private partnerships specifically. What I really mean is cooperative intervention with the different levers that the public and private sector can pull. And I'll give a specific example of that. One of the ways that BlackRock engages on topics like this is via our stewardship function, which reflects that we hold via our various investments, we hold significant ownership stakes in various portfolio companies that we engage with. We do that engagement to improve the financial outcomes for our investors. And we think sustainability issues generally and climate change specifically are a very important topic for us to be engaging with them on. Given that we believe climate risk is central to the risk and return of these companies we're invested in, we think it's very important for us to be engaging with them to push them to give more disclosed data so that we as their investors can understand the mechanisms that they're using to address the impact of climate change on their business. And that's been very effective for us. It is, however, incomplete if what we're trying to get is a full picture of the way the global economy, both the large companies and smaller companies in both the developed and emerging worlds, are engaged on these topics. So those engagement efforts also need to have the air cover, if you will, the umbrella support of public policymakers who are pushing for that disclosure. And that combined carrot and stick approach, we think, has been very productive for improving disclosure over recent years, but importantly, will lead to an explosion of new data in the years to come.
Right, that's interesting. Well, we have another question here, which is, let's scroll back. Where are we? Statistics are, we got someone says here, since the largest beneficiary of COVID-19 pandemic is probably not the human, but the environment, i.e. the atmosphere, animal life, bird life, etc. COP26 had some moving and worrying interventions as well as good analyses. So Statistics aside, what can we learn to change now for the interest of the environment? And should there be focus be more on net indicators rather than gross indicators, e.g. net national income? Anybody wish to jump in on that? Professor Stott, I can see you're smiling.
Sure. Well, I'm really going to support the idea of bringing these hard concepts, as I mentioned before, bringing these hard concepts into GDP. I don't know whether you want to think about that as net or gross. It's sort of adding more stuff in, but then, you know, any positive GDP growth that comes in our traditional GDP measure that then would be associated with negative environmental impacts or even species loss, if one could think of a way to bring those in quantitatively and credibly, then that's a big thing to do. I think there's a really important job for technicians, for the IMF, for the international statistical agencies to really sort out the details of how to do that. This is such a politically fraught area that it's important that this not be a messaging opportunity or politicized. It really needs to be technicians measuring something that's pretty well defined, just tough to measure, which is the changes in the environment and how those provide services that we don't price in the market, but services nevertheless to humans. And that's a well-defined thing to put into GDP. It's really difficult, and doing that well at a technical level is a really great undertaking, and I strongly encourage that.
Right. Professor Bhattacharya, yes.
Yeah, so actually I participated this morning in a coalition of finance ministers discussion around natural capital accounting. And, you know, that's moving quite firmly ahead with the UN, the World Bank, and others putting in a lot of effort. We heard from the UK, which presented how it's applying that. As you know, the Treasury in the UK had been leading on the biodiversity front and, you know, sponsored the Dasgupta report. There's a lot of now effort under what does that mean in terms of implementation and the metrics. So I think lots of positive things. The World Bank just came out very recently with its last report on, you know, measurement of capital. And the capital was not just physical capital, but human capital, natural capital. So, you know, thinking about, you know, these measures forces us to recognize that, you know, we are in a kind of, in a world where we should not be valuing one type of capital at the expense of another type of capital. So I think there are actually quite a lot of things underway right now that we can build on. And certainly the IMF and the World Bank have a very crucial role.
Well, I'm curious. I mean, because Christina, maybe I can bring you in from the IMF perspective, because, you know, in the past, if you said to grown-up economists, let's try and measure natural capital, you know, you'd get a bit of an eye roll. And as someone who's trained as an anthropologist, who's all about taking a wider lateral vision of economies and the concept of value, you know, I know that that is not something that people who are used to crunching numbers used to look at. Is that attitude changing inside the IMF, do you think? I mean, is the IMF about to start publishing natural capital statistics?
Not yet. I mean, it's certainly something to think about, but I'm also, I think, appreciating the complexities, because for a lot of these things we're talking about, pollination, so super critical for us. We just don't have a market value. So this is like, I really appreciate the complexity Jim was talking about. But I also want to go back to GDP. And the reason for that is that there are a lot of basic things in our GDP measurements that are not yet there. So we have a category energy, but that is not broken down into renewable energy and fossil fuel generated energy. Or, for instance, GDP consumption vis-a-vis production. So imagine an advanced economy that's mostly a service economy, and that is pretty energy clean. And then you have an EM that is producing goods and it's exporting those goods. So what can happen is that when you look at production, the production of emission is, of course, much higher in the emerging economy. But when you look at consumption, that switches exactly around. So I do also think that there could be important improvements just simply on GDP. that will help us discuss, have a better discussion on climate change policies.
That's a very interesting point. I mean, one question I'd love to ask you and also Eric from BlackRock is about whether there's too much focus right now on the intensity of emissions and not enough on the actual gross emissions. And by that, I mean that most of these targets are being presented, as I understand it, and I'm not a statistician, so please do correct me, but most of the targets are being presented in terms of, intensity without recognizing that if the economies keep growing, or put another way, they're presented in terms of emission per unit of economic activity, which matters if the economies keep growing, because of course, as the economies grow, you're going to get more emissions anyway. Are we sort of pulling the wool over people's eyes by talking about emissions-based targets that are created around, intensity, not in terms of actual activity? Would you like to jump in there, Christina, and then maybe Eric?
Yeah. No, from our side, we're looking into that and how the future goes. And we just, right ahead of COP, issued a paper. It's a so-called climate note where we try to push the debate. And there we're looking into the 2030 emissions and where are we going to be in 2030? And then think, what do we need to do now? Because there are a lot of extra factors one needs to take into account. But I also want to say we're active in the network for greening the financial sector. And that came out with an interesting report on bridging data gaps. And when we were looking at firms, it's not just the here and now. We have a firm that is very good and has very low emission intensity. That's very nice. But we want to have data going forward. We need to understand what this firm is planning to go forward. And in the sense, I would also hope that markets actually reward those firms that have larger emissions than going forward, that there is also a mechanism that those firms can be rewarded.
Eric, do you have views on that? Because, of course, if you start looking at emissions in terms of total gross emissions, rather than simply intensity, i.e. emissions per unit of output, it starts to look very different in terms of the kind of metrics and targets you're setting for countries and companies.
It's a great point, Jillian, and I agree with you. Professor Bhattacharya made an allusion earlier to the famous efforts by the financial sector to measure the temperature of a portfolio, which is an ongoing debate in the climate methodological community, how you figure out how hot or cold a particular portfolio is. And one of the big points we've been making in our engagement with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, who's helping evolve strategies for measuring temperature alignment, is that methods that focus too much on intensity and not enough on the aggregate impact of the total emissions picture, as you cite, are missing that very important piece of the narrative. So we agree that absolute emissions can't fall out of the conversation here. That said, as an investor, there are certainly circumstances in which, when I'm trying to compare the behavior of different companies at different sizes, I'm going to focus on emissions intensity to help allow for a more common comparison between way two companies are operating. But when we're planning for the future and measuring the actual climatological impact of financing a particular company's emissions, you can't do it without accounting for size. And that means looking at absolute emissions more so than intensity.
Right. Do either of the professors wish to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll just make a comment that it's actually the same in a lot of policy settings. So, of course, the goal is to have, and if we just think about the power sector, the goal is to have a power sector that has zero emissions. And so how are we going to get there? But in a lot of circumstances, a good policy to get there is to have emission standards which specify fractions of or emissions rates per megawatt hour, that sort of thing. So that's a transition path that you can use. Of course, you want to get to zero. So maybe that's the key feature is that you've got to, whether you do it on a tons basis or whether you do it on a tons per megawatt hour, the answer has to be zero by a certain date.
Right. And I'm curious, I mean, just to move on to another question, whether you think that in terms of, all the data analysis and reporting that we're looking at, whether, in the efforts to try and get standardization, we're in danger of trying to overcomplicate things or create too much in the way of a burden on companies in the system. I ask that partly because, the GFANZ and ISB initiative. And I say I'm going to keep calling it ISB because it sounds so much easier to pronounce. In the best of all worlds, that's not going to come through for another couple of years. Realistically, you can't change an entire accounting and audit system in less time than that. So would it maybe not be simpler just to tell everybody to reveal their scope 3 emissions, try and give us scope 1 and 2, give us scope 3 as well if they possibly can, and then ask companies to simply give a forward three-year forward-looking statement on where they think emissions are heading, rather than trying to get flashy, shiny, IFRS Foundation, ISSB systems in place?
Can I jump in there and say something that is maybe throwing a little bit of cold water on all of this, but I'm just going to sound like a typical economist here. Look, there's a sense in which we know the main steps that we have to take. We have to have a carbon price. We have to have a really aggressive technology pushing policy. We have to have lots of little micro level policies like more charging stations. We need to have clean electricity standards for the power sector. These are well-known things, and none of them work by themselves, but collectively, these will go a long ways towards decarbonizing the sections where we have the technology. And the technology pushing will provide the technologies of the future that we need to deal with, figuring out how to have real sustainable aviation fuels, not the ones made out of, lipids and soybean oils and palm oils and so forth. The trouble is, the reason that we get into this highly complicated discussion about scope 3 and so forth is simply because we're not willing to do the obvious, correct, low-cost things. So we have all these really smart people on this call and employees of all of these people on this call and throughout the world not using their time in the way that they should be if we just had smart policies. So this is all just to underscore the importance of Christina's other comment, which I don't want to let just slide. What can the IMF do that's the most important in this whole space? It's help the countries adopt the right smart policies that are going to allow us to make this transition and have really vibrant economies of the future. And then that will make it clean and cheap for the developing countries.
So basically, don't use all this number crunching as a distraction.
I agree with most of that, but can I just add 2 additional perspectives? One, really, I do think finance has a role to play, but I don't think we should think that finance should be specified to the last decimal point. I mean, I think the most important thing is to ensure that finance is in some sense helping to move the needle. That means moving away from activities that are clearly inconsistent with climate, and that it is tilting incentives towards financing things of the kind that Professor Stock was mentioning. So I am very much with, in some sense, the general shift, but I think we can make too much of an industry now around over-specification. So in that sense, I have the same bias. But I do also want to mention that the good policies that Professor Stock was talking about are intended to push 2 things: investment and innovation. Those are the 2 things we want in order to shift the capital stock to a better capital stock and to ensure that the new capital stock is not like the old capital stock. So particularly for the developing world, hence the importance of finance, like the Prime Minister of Barbados was talking about. We have to be able to have the finance. I co-led the Secretary General's report on the 100 billion. The 100 billion is important, but we have to think way beyond the 100 billion. We have to think about all pools of finance. And the one pool of finance that we didn't talk about at this meeting, which is absolutely critical, is the multilateral development finance system. They sit between the private sector and the countries. They can do the risk mitigation at scale, and that's the kind of public-private partnership we need, because on the one hand, we need to be able to unlock those investments. We always say there's a dearth of bankable projects. We need to unlock investments at scale, and we need to be able to bring the private sector at scale, and that's not going to happen, and I'm sure, as Larry Fink says, it will not happen without significant risk mitigation at scale.
But at present, Professor, the multilateral development banks have not been doing this on scale. I mean, the big missing chunk or missing tool in the toolkit right now is public-private blended partnerships to channel the money into the emerging markets. Why, in your view, has that not yet emerged at scale?
There are multiple reasons, but let me put it this way. Probably the principal reason is not the multilateral development banks, but the shareholders of the multilateral development banks. They have not had a clear vision, a clear sense that you have to scale this up. Every time we talk about the scaling up of the multilateral development banks, the response comes back, you need to be more efficient, and that is absolutely correct. You need to actually think about better ways of using your capital. That's absolutely correct. But you need to be able to mobilize and you get much higher private sector multipliers. That's absolutely correct. But increasing the capital of these institutions is the smartest form of international public finance that we know, and it hasn't been done. So we need the MDBs to step up in the way of unlocking investments. We need this new partnership with the private sector, because the private sector can play a very big role in this space. But if you want that long-term institutional capital, it will need not just risk mitigation, but it will need some credit enhancement, in order to be able to hold this, for the periods concerned. So I do think that those solutions are on the table. That's part of what the GFAN is about. That's what Fast Infra is about. That's what GISD right now is discussing. There are a number of private-public coalitions that are forming, and in the next year or so, I think we have the possibility of making a breakthrough.
Right. Well, certainly that's what a lot of discussion in Glasgow was about on the edges. And again, to go back to the topic of the panel, to actually frame and encourage on those private sector flows, you do also need better ways of reporting and measuring what's happening and measuring the returns. It's the returns above all else that I think people are currently asking questions about as well. So one last very quick question, which is that as green financing becomes better at measuring carbon emissions throughout the supply chain, does this imply growth will be further and further hampered in the developing countries that have so far benefited from CO2-rich industrial production being relocated from developed countries to them? So are we going to see basically one unintended side or consequence of better measuring, that developing countries are going to lose some of their most promising industries? Anyone want to jump in there quickly for the last minute or two?
I'll jump in quickly by saying that the developing countries have the opportunity actually to leapfrog and become the source of new competitiveness, because they don't have to make the mistakes of the past. Instead of clinging to the technologies of the 20th century, they should be the first in adopting the technologies of the 21st century.
Eric, I can see you nodding enthusiastically there. Would you agree?
Strongly agree. I do think it's important to recognize that, while there be costs to certain industries of the transition, of course, we think in aggregate, as a matter of macroeconomics, we think that most places in the developing and developed worlds are likely to see aggregate, GDP uplifts, to commit the Prime Minister's sin of using too much of an aggregated growth measure from the transition over time. Because we think what the transition is largely about is channeling capital into more productive technologies, more investment and innovation, to use Professor Bhattacharya's term in general. So yeah, certain sectors are going to lose here, but we think in aggregate, it's good macroeconomics to force a carbon transition, and not just because of the physical risk avoided. Though that's obviously an important part of it too. I'd make one comment on the earlier discussion if I could, which is just to say, strongly agree with the idea that investment and innovation and those big policies need to be front and center in the global climate agenda, as Professor Stock said. But I also think it would be a mistake for us to leave the panel downplaying the role that some of these data questions we've been struggling with do have to play. because I agree with the principle Professor Bhattacharya laid out, which is that when it gets to the point of, solving scope 3 emissions to the fourth decimal point, where it's probably not worth the political capital that goes into it. But I think we're a long, long way from that point. And different measurements of even scope 1 carbon emissions, no less scope 3, are wildly uncorrelated with one another. And there needs to be a lot more investment in understanding that data so that private sector finance can play that role. Doesn't take anything away from the policy argument, but both those strands need to work together.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I think it's a very great note to be ending on, because essentially I take away 2 or 3 key points from this discussion. One is that, as Prime Minister Motley laid out so forcefully and so movingly, the emerging markets countries have a great deal of anger or frustration about their situation right now, quite rightly so, particularly given what's happening in Glasgow. And one of the big questions is going to be in the coming years, how do you channel money from the advanced countries to the developing countries to help with mitigation and adaptation? A second key point that's come out very clearly is that, in trying to reshape or channel those capital flows, both from the emerging markets to the emerging ones, but also, frankly, inside the developed world too, there's going to be a lot of focus and growing focus on the question of how do you actually measure both where climate change mitigation adaptation help is needed, but also what type of projects are going to deliver returns, what are viable, and how we rethink the economy much more broadly in light of this crisis. The third point is there's clearly a lot of discussion underway now about ways of rethinking statistics and statistical measurement systems. But the fourth point is that we really haven't got there yet. So perhaps the most accurate way to sum up is that we are in a moment of terrific flux in terms of how we measure the world. GDP, as Professor Stott said, has been a very useful tool metric for the 20th century, but it's going to have to be rethought in light of these big climate change challenges for the 21st century. So, to sum it up, rarely have statistics and measurement systems been of such critical public policy importance and in so much flux. And right now, it really is a very exciting time to be a statistical geek, particularly if you're being a statistical geek that's trying to make the world greener. So thank you all very much indeed for the very interesting discussion. I believe there is now a break, and the next up is going to be, I believe, a keynote discussion with the IMF Managing Director and Professor Johan Rockström about whether climate change and the post-pandemic climate change challenge, how to hold the 1.5 degrees line. So thank you all very much indeed.